the first of NHG's webinars for the new year. And as you can see next to me is Ruth Swailes. And she's off mute as well, so that's a promising start. So we're running today a session on early learning goals with Ruth. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us in these really quite exceptional times. And we really were hoping not to be doing online at this stage in the game, but we're still here, and we'd like to be here for the foreseeable. Certainly the whole spring programme is going to be online, and we're just thinking about the summer. Let's hope some green shoots by then. I'll just quickly run through an introduction to Ruth and what Ruth's going to cover. I know she's got a lot to get through, and you've come to hear her, not me, so I shall leave you to that. I'll do a little bit of housekeeping, and I'll pass you over to Ruth to do a presentation. You don't need me to say it's a time of great upheaval and change for everyone in education at the moment, particularly people working in the earliest foundation stage. New early learning goals are coming in. They're sort of coming in at the moment for early adopters, and some of you may have some experience of that, and then coming in more fully from September this year. It says 2021, but that's this year, isn't it? Yes. Thank you. This, rewriting the non-statutory guidance development matters. You'll be needing to make some fairly major pedagogical changes over the next 12 months. So the idea of our webinar today is to help support leaders and teachers, that's you, to reflect on your current practices in the light of the changes, and to make sure you can provide a rich curriculum to meet the needs of every learner, whilst fulfilling the requirements of the new early years foundation stage. So as if you didn't have enough challenges on your plate, you've got all that to come as well. Ruth has got over 25 years experience in primary education, and over 20 of those in senior leadership, including headship. She's taught in every year group from nursery to year 6, and works in a variety of schools in different contexts. She's been an inspector, a school improvement advisor, trainer, early years consultant, a moderator in several local authorities, supporting leaders and teachers to improve outcomes for pupils. So there's not much Ruth hasn't covered in that career. And she currently advises 34 local authority schools, supports several multi-academy trusts and TSAs?
Teaching Schools Alliance.
Teaching Schools Alliance, thank you. It's still only January, I'm just getting my head around acronyms again. And she's on the International Early Years Curriculum, she is the International Early Years Curriculum Consultant for Oxford University Press. So we're going to give you today an overview of the changes to educational programmes and hopefully some of the rationale behind them, and help empower you in using them. So this is the webinar. This is a taster of what the changes are on the Early Years Foundations Early Years Foundation stage is about, and we've got the fuller course coming next week, so we'll tell you more about that later. But hopefully this will give you a flavour of it. Just in terms of housekeeping, we record these things, so we'll be showing those. I think they appear on YouTube now, so I don't think I've quite reached TikTok level, but we're getting there. We can share the slides around with you. You will be able to see your name and those of other people who signed on if you look in the chat function, and please do put questions in the chat as Ruth goes along if things occur to you. Probably best we pick those up at the end so that we don't disrupt Ruth's flow. But that'll be really helpful to get a sense of what's on your mind, and then we'll have a bit of a chat at the end when we run a bit of Q&A, a bit of poll, and see how you all are. But that's probably enough of me. I'll hand you over to Ruth. I'll drop off, and Ruth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thanks for that introduction. Morning, everybody, and thank you. Can I just reiterate, thank you for joining us today. I know how pressed you are in schools at the moment, so the fact that you've given over a precious hour of your time to come and do this is really quite something. So I'm very honoured that you're doing that. I am going to now share my screen, and hopefully you can see all of that. And you'll see that I've got a PowerPoint that I'm going to share with you this morning. There is a lot to cover, and I will be zipping through some of these slides because obviously I'm going to talk in detail about some of these things next week. I want to give you an overview and just get you thinking about what you need to consider as a leader, as a teacher, as somebody who's got some responsibility for early years. And as Andy said, you know, a lot of change coming and lots to think about pedagogically. And I want us just to take a little bit of time this morning to step back and consider what's changing, what's happening with the timelines, what we can expect to see, what you'll need to consider as a leader, and just to really reflect for yourself and think about next steps. And if you do join me next week, I will be unpicking some of these goals in great depth and detail, some of the things that I think are problematic. But I just want to flag a few things for you that you might want to be thinking about And what I intend to do next week is build some meat on the bones of that and talk about, well, this might be problematic, but here's a way that we can support children to learn in the most developmentally appropriate way while meeting those early learning goals. So I'm sure you're aware of the context and what was supposed to happen. And as you can see, things were rumbling along post consultation, after the early assessment review in 2017, there was pilot, we were supposed to be consulted, we were consulted, and then everything fell apart a little bit in March, as I'm sure you remember. And so lots of the things that were supposed to happen in this timeline just weren't able to because of COVID. So we did wonder whether things would go ahead as planned, but they are. So early adopters, some of you will be in the room now, and some of you will already be exploring and using these goals. Some of you are here today to think about, what does that mean for me? So everybody should be using the goals by September 2021. That was what was supposed to happen. Most of the timeline went ahead as planned without the training. There were some issues around that additional training. So back in March, I was part of a tender to run some of that training for these goals. What's going to happen? What can we expect? What should we think about? And that was supposed to happen in June and July of this year. And of course, that couldn't happen. So that means that lots of people who are early adopters are already using these goals without any additional training from the DFE. There's been lots of webinars. Obviously, I've been doing lots of stuff like this, but quite a lot of it applied together for yourself. I am now, I'm very aware that there is training coming, though it will now be online, and the first lot of training should be coming out within the next couple of months. The exemplification materials that we were expecting to have to use aren't available yet, and the reason being that they were supposed to be in schools with real children. Obviously that can't happen at the moment. So those exemplification materials we were hoping would be online quite soon. They look like they're going to be delayed again because of this third lockdown. So there's some quite major things that should have happened that haven't. And so what we're trying to do is piece bits together and work our way through this. There are some changes to the way that the goals are being reported. Most significantly, you will just be reporting when these goals become statutory. You will just be reporting as to whether a child is emerging or expected, and the exceeding judgment will no longer be something that you will put forward. So there's something to think about there. Because as we know, even within 3 goals, is emerging and emerging. There's a child who's emerging who's got some quite complex needs, and then there's a child who's on the cusp of being expected. And the same with exceeding. You've got a child who is just over the threshold, and then you've got a really sort of quite high-flying child in certain areas, and that will be reduced to just 2 judgments. So there's a lot of conversation to have there between yourself and the receiving teacher about, this child is expected, but this child is expected who is likely to be able to achieve greater depth. So that's a big change. Perhaps the biggest change of all, I would say, in terms of the actual overarching picture of this new framework, change to moderation. The statutory requirement for local authorities to moderate will end when these goals become statutory. So if you're an early adopter, you will not be moderated this year. If you are still using the old goals, you can still be moderated. There is still a statutory requirement for LAs to do that. But after this year, that requirement goes. And that's been received in a very mixed way. Some people are delighted about that, and other people are quite anxious about that. And this anxiety has been exacerbated a little by the lack of exemplification materials. Quite a few people approaching me and saying, well, how do I know that I'm making the right judgments? So that's quite a big thing to think about and reflect on. It is worth looking at the context of how we've got these goals. The 2017 assessment review had a question about whether people felt the goals needed a change, and lots of people felt that they did. It's worth remembering that the last set of goals were developed in 2012 after the Tickell review of 2011, and the national curriculum has changed significantly since then. And there's always been a tension between the early learning goals and the national curriculum and Key Stage 1 requirements, and that has kind of developed into something quite a wide chasm as the change to the national curriculum came in. So that's where the rationale for this came from. And then there was a pilot, 24 schools were involved in that pilot. And while they were involved in the pilot, the Education Endowment Foundation did some research based on what was happening in the pilot and what people found as time went on. So what those pilot schools were seeing as different issues. And it's worth just reflecting on these as you're going forward, thinking, is this an issue? Is this something that I might need to have a look at? There was some confusion about whether the goals constituted curriculum. And what the EEF pilot study recommended was, given the confusion, there needs to be further guidance about the nature of the goals as an assessment tool at the end of the foundation stage, rather than a curriculum in itself. And that was something that was probably going to be included in the training that didn't happen. So some real clarity here, and we need more clarification, we need more guidance when the goals are rolled out. There were also some specific concerns about particular goals, and I'm just going to flag up a few of those now, because you'll need to be reflecting on those and thinking about them going forward. So one of the more controversial goals, and those of you who know me will know that I've been harping on about this for some time, the fine motor skills goal, very much open to interpretation according to those within the pilot. Some people had disparities around whether they felt that the tripod grip had to be an absolute, and some people were interpreting it as best fit. And it is worth remembering that the foundation stage goals are still best fit. So it's not a case of having to meet every single one of the criteria. It's broadly, is the child within this? Is that the best fit for the child? So for some people, they interpreted the goal around physical development, the fine motor skills, as being the child has to have a dynamic tripod grip. And other people said a comfortable grip will do. And quite a few people raised the fact that this is actually quite a challenging thing to ask children of 4 and 5 to be able to achieve, because actually what we know is that those children's hands aren't always fully developed at this stage. And just going to share with you briefly an X-ray of children's hands. This is a boy here at 6 months old. You can see that there are very few bones here. This is all cartilage here, and what happens is a process of what we call ossification, which is where the cartilage turns to bone. If you look at the child at 8 years old, you can see here that the wrist bones are fully developed, and the bones in the fingers are also fully developed. But if you look at this child at 6, and remember this goal is for when the child is aged between 4 and 5, many of those bones are not yet ossified. The process is not an exact science. It isn't happy birthday, have some bones, but it's a continuum over time, and it tends to be faster and more advanced in girls than in boys. So girls tend to be anything between 6 months to a year ahead of boys in their ossification, which is why sometimes children will find writing quite painful, quite problematic. So this is something to think about, because we can't speed this up. So that was raised as a concern, and also raised as a concern that actually occupational therapists do not expect young children to have a dynamic tripod grasp until somewhere between the ages of 4.5 to 6. But if you went to most occupational therapists and said, this child hasn't got a dynamic tripod grasp yet, they would not necessarily be worried unless the child was aged over 6. And so there's a real tension here around the expectation of what we will get children to do and what is typical development. And there's a danger that we could end up pathologizing what is just typical development. And there's also some complexities around the links between the gross and the fine motor, which I intend to unpick quite a lot on the course next week. But this is something to think about and consider. What we can't do is say, well, the bones aren't ossified, so we're not going to teach the child to write. But what we do need to do is think about how we provide a wealth of opportunities to make sure that we make it as far as possible that the child will get that in a developmentally appropriate way. Again, the past was another goal that came up as being problematic. And in the pilot, some people had taken a little bit of a key stage 1 approach to this and thought, actually, we're going to do a specific person in history and teach them about Florence Nightingale. And actually, they found that children weren't developmentally ready for that, because what we know about young children is they're quite egocentric. So when we're talking about the past for them, we need to talk about their past and their history to make it meaningful for them. So these were some of the things that were raised as issues in the pilot. Again, a similar issue raised around people and communities, that they were thinking about something that was quite abstract. And some of these were taken on board in the consultation, and some of these goals have changed a little, but not, some of them not significantly. So these are things we need to think about in terms of our curriculum. How do we teach children about people and communities in a meaningful way that resonates with them and is meaningful to them, but meets the need of, you know, actually achieves this early learning goal? So quite a lot to think about there. This is possibly one of the most controversial ones that keeps being talked about. The removal of shape, space and measures as a goal. It will no longer be an early learning goal. And what the pilot found was that while no school had stopped teaching this altogether, it had definitely had an impact on their maths curriculum. And what we know about the teaching of shape, space and measure is it's phenomenally important for young children. There are a series of significant studies that show that children who have good spatial awareness and who develop that in early childhood, they'll want to do well in STEM subjects in later life. And so this was a huge concern about removing it from the goals. And as one person fed back, some people will say, well, we'll still teach it. And this teacher said, I'll still mention shape, I do mention the vocabulary, but it's not in my content lesson because it's not something that we have to teach. And this is the danger around the goals becoming the curriculum. Because it's not a goal, it suddenly doesn't have this emphasis that we've always put on shape, space and measure, and that's a genuine concern. So these are things to think about. We need to think about what we know makes a difference for young children. Even though the goals have changed, what we need to retain in our curriculum because we know it makes a difference. So the big concern was that when people fed back on the curriculum and on the pilot scheme, they really, quite a lot of people felt that this would lead to an increase in the amount of structured delivery time because there was a lot of facts for children to know and remember. And this was a huge concern. And it was really, really pleasing to see that actually when the consultation document did finally come out in June, this was addressed in the consultation document. And they quite categorically stated that it's not a prescription of the way you have to teach. This is what it says in the EYFS reforms document. There's a recognition that actually an effective early years curriculum has a range of skilled teaching practices. You know, you use a range of strategies as a teacher. And I think if there's one question that I'm asked, you know, more frequently than any other, it's how much adult led, how much child initiated. And my answer to that is I don't know, because I don't know your, I don't know your context. And as a teacher, for me, that always varied year on year, cohort to cohort. It will be different in September to how it is in July. And I think this is about this consultation response gives us the confidence to say, actually, I know what I'm going to do for my children when it's appropriate. So there are definitely some things that are much more appropriate when they're taught whole class, adult led. And there are other things that children need to embrace and practice and explore in continuous provision. And that's your judgment as a skilled practitioner. There's no hard and fast rule about having a percentage of child-led, a percentage of adult-led. And it's about teachers using their professional judgment to respond appropriately to that. But really, really pleasing, in the consultation response, they've included Ofsted's definition of teaching, which is in the Ofsted handbook. It's page 80, it's a footnote on page 80 of the Ofsted handbook. And I think this is a really powerful definition. So I think really useful to see this in the new framework. And basically, in short, what this says is everything that you do with young children in the classroom is teaching. Particular words that I think are really important that we need to really reflect on and think about: communicating, modelling language, showing, explaining, demonstrating, exploring ideas, encouraging, questioning, recalling. It actually accounts for the fact that your environment is part of your teaching repertoire, and it accounts for the fact that the structure and routines of your day are part of your teaching repertoire. And when we talk next week, I'm going to really unpick this and talk about this in quite some detail, because I think this is a really, really powerful driver for good, effective early years pedagogy. So that's really pleasing to see that in there and really reassuring. It is important to go back to the rationale of why the goals changed. And I mentioned already that they wanted to align the EYFS with the national curriculum. So some of the rationale here is worth having a look at and thinking about, so you can look at your changes through the lens of, is it meeting the rationale here? They wanted to make the goals clearer, more specific, and easier to make accurate judgments. They wanted to focus on strengthening language and vocabulary development, and we all know how important that is. Significant amount of research to show that it underpins all other areas of learning. And that was particularly around focusing on supporting disadvantaged children. To strengthen the literacy and numeracy outcomes, so that all children have a good grasp of these ready for year one. And these are the two outcomes that fewer children get than any other. And writing in particular is the one outcome that the fewest children get nationally. And when we know how complex writing is and what that entails, it's not really very surprising. What we ask of our very young children is quite challenging. And I am going to unpick that quite a lot next week as well, because I think that is the goal that most people find the hardest to get. And it's the goal that the DFE have set themselves a target of making sure that they reduce the number of children who don't get it. But the target they've set is for 2028, which kind of gives you a picture of how challenging they know that is. They wanted to ensure that the goals were based on the latest evidence of child development. And they wanted to reduce teacher workload. And this is a real fundamental change and something that you really need to reflect on. There's been a push for a while now, certainly as long as I've been a moderator, things, and that's going back 14, 15 years, things have been changing in terms of what is expected for moderation. But sometimes that message isn't always getting through. And one of the reasons for removing moderation was that lots of people perceive that moderators require a specific amount of evidence for each early learning goal. And certainly in the EYFSP handbook, which comes out every December, it's really, really clear that that's not the case. But I think for some people who've had an experience where it's not been a positive experience, that sits with people. And so they get very hung up on evidencing lots and lots of children's learning, taking lots of photographs, annotating them. And there's a real push in this framework to move away from that. And if I'm honest with you, some people are finding that quite challenging because it's embedded practice. We've been doing it for years and years, and to suddenly make that change is quite scary. So there's a real push here on reducing workload. And what I'm getting people to reflect on is this something that I need to document? Does this observation, does this photograph have a positive impact? Will it make a difference to the child? And if not, why am I doing that? And again, next week when we have some more time, I'm really going to explore that and the rationale behind documentation, what we might need, what we might consider and think about. What I always try to do in my training is give you lots to think about. I won't tell you what to do, but I'll make you reflect and think about it in the context of your particular setting, because you have to make it work for you. But the DFE rationale behind this was streamlining assessment guidance and strengthening the message that teachers use their professional judgment and not rely on unnecessary evidence to justify their assessments. So there's a really clear message coming through loud and clear here that you are the professional, you know the child, you don't have to document everything. That's proving quite tricky to let go of though. So there are all the rationale behind it, and you will get the presentation, and obviously you'll have a chance to look through this and reflect on it. One of the rationale being, let's focus on what we know makes a difference. And I'm flagging this document up here because I find this a really powerful and useful document called Getting It Right in the Early Years Foundation Stage, a Review of Evidence. And it's a document that a coalition of early years practitioners and associations put together in response to the initial new early learning goals. It references 388 pieces of high quality research which has been carried out over the last 10 years and been peer reviewed and been done on a large scale. And what they've done in the research review is pulled out the things that they found make the most difference for young children. If you're interested in this, you can get a free copy of it. If you go to the early education website, you can just download it. And it is really powerful, really interesting reading. So if you're a bit nerdy about research like I am, that's a really good place to go and start and have a look. But in short, what the key messages that this particular research review found was that the prime areas are crucial and time sensitive. What that means is if we don't get that right in this early stage of child development, it is much, much more difficult later on. And of particular importance is communication and language. Not really very shocking, probably underpins what we already know, but how great to have a big research document that tells us what we feel is actually the case. If you are not proficient in communication and language, everything else becomes very, very tricky. There's an acknowledgement in this document that all areas of learning are interconnected, and this is why we find it quite difficult in early years to separate things out into history, geography, etc. Because young children don't work like that. We don't think like that when we're working with young children. You'll cover a range and a multitude of different areas of learning with one particular activity that you're doing. And also interestingly, noting that there's no evidence to support that giving maths and literacy greater emphasis actually gives better outcomes. There's you know, that's not to say that we don't do that, but what we know is if the prime areas aren't there, it doesn't matter how great you are as an English and maths teacher, you are really building on sand. Those prime areas have to be in place and are of paramount importance. And the other thing that they noted was that the characteristics of effective teaching and learning are fundamental and also time sensitive. So there's a growing body of research around what we call self-regulation and executive function, something that we really need to unpick and look at. So I recommend to all my schools that I work with that we go back to the characteristics and look at these. And next week I am going to unpick these and talk about how we might use these to support our thinking around curriculum. These are really powerful and they're time sensitive. And again, if these aren't in place, it becomes much, much harder to teach those young children. So these three characteristics: engagement, motivation, and creating and thinking critically. And I always think this one is really quite revealing in just how much language this requires. And that comes back again to that underpinning knowledge of language and communication being hugely important to every aspect of children's learning. We talked about the time sensitivity. This is a really interesting illustration of sensitive periods in children's brain development. And what you can see from this is that even by the time children are coming to join us in school, some of those sensitive periods are already starting to taper off. But you'll see that by the age of 6, it suddenly becomes much, much harder to embed those key skills that we know that we need. But if we look at language in particular, and what the statistics tell us, and the DFE's own statistics tell us, is, you know, if we haven't got that in place by the time the child is 6, a significant number of children are likely to go on to develop other special educational needs, particularly around literacy, but also around behaviour. So what we really, really have to make sure that we focus on is getting these things right. There is something in that phrase, give me a child before they're 7 and I'll show you the man. You know, it's hugely important that we make sure we get these things in place in the early years. So this is what the feedback in the consultation review was on the prime areas. A real positive around the emphasis on vocabulary, but some people expressed a view that there were some elements that were too advanced. There's quite a lot in there about using the correct tense and making sure that children are using the correct conjunctions, and that's quite advanced for very young children, particularly if they're using English as an additional language and they're new to English. So this was some of the feedback. I'm not going to dwell too much on this because you can read it at your leisure, but what I will say is that some of the goals that were in the pilot and some of the goals that were proposed were tweaked slightly based on some of the feedback. And what I would say as well, which I think is also a real positive, is they reflected on the feedback from the EEF review and said, actually, we need to put much more than the goals in. So there are what we call educational programs, and I'm going to really reflect on those next week as well, because the educational programs for me are a little bit like the national curriculum is in Key Stage 1 and 2. They give you more depth. It's like the programs of study. This is what we should be covering. They are not the complete curriculum. You will still need to make it adapted and appropriate for your school, but they give you a flavour of the whole of the curriculum rather than just being those goals right at the very end. So these are the changes. You'll see that very little has changed. They're tweaks really, but I would say that those educational programmes are where the majority of the tweaks are and where you will find quite a lot of helpful information. You'll see that maths in particular has been one where they've responded quite and made some, not changes to the goals, but some significant changes to the educational programmes. So they have put a statement in there about shape, space and measure, spatial reasoning, and a love of maths. It's really pleasing to see. So what I would say to you is it's important to remember that the goals are not the curriculum. Look at the educational programmes. The goals are what we expect in June at the end of early years foundation stage. That's what we're working towards. So I would start by looking at the educational programmes, and that's what we're really going to do next week, and think about, where does this sit with my practice? Is there something I need to change here? There will be some changes you need to make, but actually what you may find, and what I'm finding with the schools that I'm working with that I know well, when we've looked at these, we've said, actually, we're doing all this stuff anyway, these are going to happen. And then there are some minor tweaks around things where, particularly in the maths goals, for example, we might want to shift the emphasis slightly. But what I would urge you to do is not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of really, really good practice going on in your classrooms already, and this is not about throwing all that away. You need to really look and think, what's good, what's strong, what do I need to keep, and then what do I need to tweak? Just to hold on to the fact that no specific requirement to evidence any of these outcomes. And that's a really strong message coming through loud and clear. How you monitor, how you evidence, how you record is entirely up to you as a school. It's up to schools and teachers to decide how much is sufficient evidence. And that's quite a tricky discussion. We're going to have that quite a long discussion about that next week, because that's really difficult to get a handle on. And I think it's an ongoing discussion. It's one of those ones that you're constantly revisiting and revising and coming back to. But the only statutory requirement is the profile at the end. Obviously, from next year, the other statutory requirement will be the baseline, but that will be completely unrelated to EYFSP. So I've included the goals in the presentation so you can have a good look at them, but I'm not going to read them to you. I've put them here for you to have a look at. Next week, we will have a look at the educational programmes and think about that and reflect on what that might look like in practice. As I say, that there are things that are controversial. This one in particular, this one about using past, present and future tenses and making use of conjunctions. That's quite a tricky one. And what I would urge you to do is remember, this is best fit. So if you have a child who's got every other area of this speaking goal, but they're a bit wobbly on this, that's a professional judgment decision, and that's something you'll need to discuss with your leadership team, or as a leadership team, with your teachers, with the receiving teachers. So you might say, well, actually, they're using past and present, not always accurate, but on the whole, they've got the whole of the speaking goal. And until we get some further clarification and some further exemplification for those early adopter schools, that's what I'm advising people to do. It's about making sure you make the best judgments for the children, and doing what you can with what you've got right now. Self-regulation is a new goal, and I'm going to explore this quite a bit because it's very difficult to self-regulate if children haven't had co-regulation. So we're going to talk about that at length next week. It's quite a tricky one. But again, this can be quite controversial because people have argued that the third part of this goal isn't actually self-regulation. It's following instructions and understanding language. So we'll unpick that in quite a lot of detail. Some of these are not too controversial. It's exactly what you want and expect children to do. The physical development goal has been split into gross motor and fine motor, and I was really excited to see that because I'm absolutely passionate about motor development. A little bit disappointed with the quality of the goals, but I'm pleased to say that the educational programme has some more detail in it. I'd like more, but it's a start. So we're going to look at that in detail as well. And you'll see, this is the one that I referred to earlier. Using the tripod grip in almost all cases. Again, that's open to interpretation. The reading goal has been split into comprehension and word reading. Nothing too surprising in there really. It's what we've been doing in phonics for many years now, so not too controversial. And the writing goal, we expected it to be more challenging, to be honest, but I suspect that the reason that it isn't is because people recognise just how challenging this is for young children. And next week I'm really going to talk about, you know, all the different aspects of writing and how, you know, there's a lot more to writing than just transcription and the physicality of it. We're really going to unpick the emotional side of writing, the communicative side of writing as well. Hasn't changed too significantly from the previous writing goal, but still the one that fewest children get. These are the ones that have probably changed more than any. It's really pleasing to see that it's about a deep understanding of numbers to 10. So that review that was in the last review where we went to numbers to 20, which caused a lot of issues, pleasing to see that there's a recognition that there's no developmental reason for doing that, and actually having a really good, strong understanding of numbers to 10 is much more powerful. This is proving quite controversial. Automatically recalling without reference to rhymes, counting or other aids. It seems to fly in the face of everything we're encouraging children to do further up the school, which is to use manipulatives, etc. And I will unpick these quite a lot as well. And numerical patterns has replaced shape, space and measure. Past and present, we've already talked a little bit about why that was controversial. So it has been tweaked a little, and you now don't have to talk about a historical figure from the past. So we'll talk a lot about how you can incorporate good historical thought into an early years curriculum next week. People and communities, when I talk to schools about this, they're already doing a lot of this, but it was really pleasing to see in the educational programme, because in the goals it talks about a lot about what's being read in class, and we did try to push for and experience to be added to these goals, but they weren't budging on that. But it's gone into the educational programme. It's now there that you need to provide a wide range of experiences for your pupils. And, you know, I don't know a single teacher that doesn't go outside and explore the natural world. There's nothing too controversial in there. The creative goals, there was a feeling that a lot of it was being done to children. So again, in the educational programme, there's a lot more about children experiencing a range of creative activities and opportunities. But really pleasing to see role play really taking a high priority in the creative and imaginative and expressive goals. I do wonder when it's not appropriate to move in time for music. I'm not quite sure when that would be. But lots around narrative and story. So a real recognition of the power of vocabulary, language, conversation, narrative, stories. And that comes through quite clearly in lots of the educational programmes. So really, I just wanted to leave you with a few things to consider. You need to think about what the removal of moderation will mean for your schools and for your teachers. Some people are quite anxious about that, to the point where I've got people actually saying, well, we don't have to moderate, but would you help us to moderate? I would look for opportunities to moderate either across classes, across maths, across chains. You might want to work in collaboration with other local schools, just to get that supportive collaboration going. I know it's really tricky at the moment, but I do think that for teachers who are doing this for the first time, this is quite scary. So think about the impact of that removal of that that process and what you might do to mitigate for any issues that come up for that. There is a lack of clarity around some of the goals. They are open to interpretation. What I've said to people is do the best you can with the information that you have. And the main thing is that you are secure in your judgments. You're happy to say, yes, you think that child fits the broad majority of that goal. And what I've always said to people is, if you're not sure, have a word with the receiving teacher and say, you know, this is what the child is doing. This is what the goal says. This is what I'm thinking, and make that decision together. That can be really powerful and helpful. Just have a think about what the changes in emphasis mean and look at it through the lens of your curriculum. Think, do you need to change anything in your curriculum, in your practice? And I think as well, we have to bear in mind that, you know, everybody is facing significant changes already this year. We've adapted more than we ever have to. This has to be managed quite carefully and sensitively because there's a lot going on. So it's what you can't do is say, we're going to push that down the road, it's not going to happen. It's coming. And actually not addressing it can be as scary for teachers as taking it head on and saying, let's have a look at these goals, let's have a look at these programs, let's talk about them. But being mindful that there's a lot going on. And just before I finished, I did want to touch very briefly on this, because this is proving quite controversial and giving people quite a lot of anxiety. Development Matters is a non-statutory document, and it was designed to give people a broad understanding of typicality in terms of child development. And as that, it's a really useful tool. It was never ever designed to be an assessment tool. And in fact, across the bottom of 41 of the pages, it says, do not use this as a tick list. Children develop in different ways at different rates. Unfortunately, a lot of commercial tools have taken this and put it into tracking systems, and that's proved really problematic, where we get people ticking off against statements, sticking photographs against statements, you know, saying keeping children within a band. I've seen that where people have said, oh, well, I can't put them in 30 to 50 months because they haven't got this particular thing. That's not what this is. It has been, there is a new version of it. If you look at the new version, you'll see that it's also non-statutory. And you'll see that this also talks about it being a curriculum rather than guidance about child development. And it's proving quite controversial because what people are doing, the first band in this new version is birth to 3. And what people are doing is trying to split that into sub-bands when it's been put into a broad band to stop people from doing that. I'm going to talk a lot about this next week because I think this is probably causing more anxiety than the goals are. But I did just want to flag up what it says in the front of this new document. It sets out a pathway for development. It's not linear, neat and orderly. So it's about broad typicality. It is not a tick list. And again, it talks about you using your professional knowledge to help children make progress without needing to record lots of steps. So it's not about paperwork. So please, please, please don't go turning this into a grid, as I've seen lots of people doing and ticking it off. And it's about depth of learning. And the person who wrote Development Matters has given some advice about, you know, what are you assessing? The person who wrote the new version is Dr. Julian Grenier, and he talked about, think carefully about what you're intending to do. Why are you observing? What are you observing? What do you want to get from the observation? What documentation do you need to have? And think about what you're going to do with it. So this is about taking assessment back to what I think is its rightful purpose, which is finding out where children are, finding out what their interests are, the strengths and their areas for development, and then building your curriculum around what they need. So you will have a broad curriculum overview already, but it's about really focusing in on what do these children need to do well. And Julian Grenier is really clear. He said, you know, schools have moved away from levels. Now early years needs to do the same. We are going to talk quite a lot about this next week because it is the thing that's causing quite a lot of anxiety, and people are reluctant to let go of that tracking, and people are reluctant to let go of all that documentation. So it really does need a discussion and someone picking more than I can do in a webinar. But I think it's worth flagging that up. I always talk about remarking on the remarkable. Is it a key wow moment for that child? If it's something that makes me think, crikey, they've never done that before, that's significant, and that might be something I'd want to record. What I do see in lots of learning journals is 30 photographs of every child doing the same thing. And that to me is not the purpose of observation and assessment. And I think it's worth having that discussion. I'm very aware it's now 10:20, and I want to sort of hand over and give you a chance to put any questions to me and to have a little bit of a discussion around it. So I'm just going to sort of finish now. And one of the things I have put on here that you might find useful, I did an in conversation with Dr. Helen Williams, who's an early years maths specialist. And I've put the link on there if you do want to have a look at it. We recorded it, and it literally was Helen and I talking about what we think some of the issues are around the maths goal and how you can deal with that in a pedagogically appropriate way. So I just popped that there for you to look at. I know it's been a whistle stop because there's a lot in it, and as I say, next week I really will unpick quite a lot of the things that I've raised, but I hope I've given you things to think about, things to reflect on, and some ideas going forward. So I'm going to hand over. I'm going to stop screen sharing now. I'm shut up in a minute.
I didn't want to stop you in full flow, Rose. No, I thought I'd pop up, not least because you've been speaking without hesitation, repetition, or deviation for about 30, 35, maybe even 40 minutes. So thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, really good and clear presentation, and pragmatic and helpful and balanced, I thought. And I hope other people found it that. I know it's a difficult subject, a controversial subject in many ways, and there are 1,000 different ways you might want to do this kind of thing to 6-year-olds. So thanks for guiding us through that. As we say in the chat, there is a chat function if you want to put questions. Probably rather than unmuting people, if you've got a question to put to Ruth, do it in the chat, and we'll I can put it to her. Can we put the link on Ruth's final page on the chat, please?
Yeah, sure. We'll do that.
I think Ruth can do that because she's got it magically to hand.
Hold on, I'll do my best I can with that.
And certainly we'll email around with either the slides you've just seen or a version of them anyway. Because I think that's quite a full deck. And obviously you'll be covering, as you said, you'll be covering that in full length on next week's course. But we've got 2.5, 3 hours, I think, next week to go to really get under the skin of things.
To do that next week. Yeah, it was a flavour today.
I was just while waiting for questions. Here we are. Can I access the slides recording on a different occasion? Yeah, we can probably do that. We do record our sessions, so I'm sure we can find a way around that. And certainly this webinar we're putting out there, and Ruth's now put up the link to the chat she's got with Helen Williams for you to access and link onto that. I mean, I was particularly struck by what you're saying about best fit, and it's all about outcomes, not goals. I think it's right that these are an aspiration, they're an aim, they're a structure for what you need to be doing, but they're not everything. And there's seems to me there's a lot of room for teachers to use common sense and make these goals something that actually works for them and works for their classes. Is that right, Ruth? Or am I being overly ambitious?
No, absolutely. I think it's EYFS has always been best fit. It's the only one now in the whole of the school that is, and we need to hold on to that. So it's the key purpose of the original and still the core purpose of the original early years foundation stage profile is to give high quality information to hand over to your year one teachers, so they've got a really good flavour of where those children are. But I've always said the important thing is the discussion that you have, and it's always been a statutory requirement to give time to reception and year one teachers to talk over that. You know, you don't just hand over the scores on the doors, because we all know there's a child who's a 2 who is, you know, you're literally just waiting to see them do it and say they're just over the cusp of it. And then there's a child who's a 2 who might actually be really close to, you know, being an exceeding in the past. So it's the discussion you have that matters. So best fit is really important. And the other thing I would say is that it's important to remember that every single time we have a new assessment system, we have a bit of a dip. If you think about Key Stage 2 in 2014, and everybody was, you know, I was getting text messages off my school saying I've got to resign, you know, I've got my outcomes are this, and then they turned out to be above national average. And the same in 2012 when we had the new EYFSP last time, 52% of children got the goals. Now it's about getting used to a system, so I think we have to be a bit kind to ourselves as well and say, you know, we're doing the best we can. It is likely that you will find that some of the children don't get these goals because it's new. That doesn't mean you've not served them well.
No, that's true of any assessment or any exam. You bring in something new, people got to take time to adapt to it.
Absolutely.
And don't be too hard on yourselves, because we're living in exceptional times. You know, there's quite enough going on. Just getting kids through the door and keeping them safe and
absolutely.
the path, and getting teachers through the door as well.
I mean, I'm frankly, you know, absolutely amazed and impressed that 3,000 schools have still chosen to go ahead to be an early adopter in these exceptional times. You know, I think that's really quite something, and that says a lot about the teaching profession, in that, you know, there's that feeling of, well, it's coming, so we'll get on with it, you know. But I just think being a bit kind to ourselves is key at the moment.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And I was also impressed by the fact we got Aristotle into our webinar. Yeah, give me the child until he's 7, and I'll show you the man. So that's not bad for a dark January morning, is it?
I do try.
I'm sure people will have thousands. I haven't got questions popping up in the chat, but I'm sure people will be mulling things. If you've got particular questions for Ruth, obviously sign up to the course next week. That'd be great. We'll cover everything in a lot more depth. We'll have a more interactive function where we can have people going into chat rooms and talking and talking directly to Ruth. If there's anything you'd like to put our way that sort of crops up to you sort of over coffee later on, or in 3 o'clock in the morning, things tend to come to me, do drop us a line at events@naht.org.uk, and we can pick things up that way. We'll put them to Ruth, and we can make sure we cover them next Wednesday. Some nice positive comments you can see them, I'm sure, for yourself, Ruth.
Have a little look.
Saying how informative, so that's great. So yeah, so if you'd like more, do join us on Wednesday. I will just probably leave it there then. I will. So thanks, Ruth, for your comprehensive coverage, or opening the Pandora's box, really, shall we say?
Always happy to do that.
And so we'll look at that. We'll look at that in more depth next week. There's a little poll if people would care to take the time just to say how you found today, and any feedback helps us help you really in planning what we can put on for you, and what we need to cover and what indeed we don't need to cover. As I say, any questions, do drop us a line at events@naht.org.uk. Do have a look at our website for details of any other training we can offer. NAHT membership, there's a special offer on at the moment. If you join or encourage someone else to join, and details about our NAHT Wellness and Protect program, which is there to help support your well-being in these really dark January days and difficult times. So there is support out there, and you're not alone. And obviously unity is strength, and the NHT is there to support you, and we're aiming our best to do that. And then if I can just quickly plug a few things we've got coming up. Next Monday, which I think is called Blue Monday, it's probably the grimmest day in the year. So Monday the 8th of January, we've got James Pope from Heads Up is going to give us a webinar, hopefully to enthuse and revitalise this a bit and be quite positive about the support that's out there. On Tuesday next week, we've got a webinar on updating where we are on Ofsted with Philip Roddlehead, which usually goes down very well. We've got a course for that the following week. So if you want to know what Ofsted are up to, and they're never far away from the public eye, are they? Join us for that. Then Wednesday next week, Ruth will be back here, as we've said many a time, and then other courses, and there are details available on the AHT website. And we're hoping to run one on statutory relationships and health. So we're into the start of a busy spring programme. And I'd just like to say, again, thank you, Ruth, for your time today, for a comprehensive and pragmatic overview. And thank you particularly to everyone on the call for taking an hour out from your busy and crazily hectic calendars at the moment to be with us. And I hope everyone's learned something and hopefully been reassured. And so hopefully we'll see you again next week. But thank you everyone for your time, and thank you, Ruth.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone.
As well.